Hello, everybody. Good morning, and how are you today? I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, where we are heading toward the end of our readings of The Paperclip Conspiracy, The Hunt for the Nazi Scientist by Tom Bauer. Another look at the paperclip material after we've studied Annie Jacobson in her book, the great book, the Operation Paperclip, but this one's a little more specific, and I think it's got a lot of detail that we didn't get from Annie Jacobson, although this was written earlier, like a generation earlier. So anyway, we are now in near the end of the book. We finished with the book up to page 200 and let's see, where did we stop? At any rate, we were just reading the part where the Americans were starting to suss out the fact that when German records referred to uh, large pigs in their experiments, that they were really talking about human beings. And the gruesome experiments that they were doing are all, well, pretty much well known. If not, you can almost imagine them yourselves. There's plenty of documentation. The CIA and other agencies were using Paperclip as a cover for importing those who they wanted to reward for cooperation and to import the supposedly advanced science of the Nazis, where it was rocketry or other types of weapons, especially now chemical weapons. And as we get into this next chapter, biological weapons. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and read a page from this chapter, Rewriting the Past, right now, just to give you an idea where we're headed. Prosecuted at Nuremberg together with the aviation doctors, Kurt Blome was acquitted because the prosecution failed to prove that his, quote, intention, unquote, to experiment with inmates had actually been realized. Shortly after his release from Nuremberg in 1951, Blomberg was interviewed about his work by Dr. H.W. Batchelor and three other American biological warfare experts from Camp Detrick, Maryland. By way of introduction, Batchelor explained to Blome that through an interpreter that, quote, we have friends in Germany, scientific friends, and this is an opportunity to enjoy meeting him to discuss our various problems, unquote. For the Americans, it was an ideal opportunity to discuss the whole area of German biological warfare, including Blome's own discoveries, and elicit his help in finding other German biological warfare experts. Batchelor was clearly delighted with his cooperation, and as a reward, he was offered a Project 63 contract. So this is leading us directly to Fort Detrick and Kurt Blome. Just another little snippet from the doctors from Berlin. I'm not going to read the second half of the chapter because you probably get the picture, but here's one that I will read. The extreme fatal experiments, wrote Rascher, were carried out on specifically selected people. Otherwise, it would not have been possible to exercise the strict controls which are vitally necessary for the experiment. The human guinea pig specially selected for the first, quote, terminal experiment, unquote, was a, quote, 37-year-old Jew in good condition, unquote, who lasted just 30 minutes. His death was carefully noted as he began to perspire and wriggle his head, developed cramps, became breathless, and with foam collecting around his mouth, lost consciousness and died. With Welch set aside, Rascher performed the autopsy, calling out his observations to his assistant, including peculiar collections of blood and air bubbles or embolisms in the heart valves and brain ventricles. The case was, he proudly boasted to Himmler, quote, the first one of this type ever observed on man. The above described heart actions will merit particular scientific interest because they were recorded until the very last moment by an electrocardiogram, unquote. In later experiments, the victim, a Jew accused of, quote, race pollution, unquote, was taken unconscious from the pressure chamber and drowned so that air embolisms could be accurately traced during the autopsy. So that's one paragraph out of a number of pages here which show you the reality of these Nazi doctors. And now we're going to the cover up, in which the chapter is titled Rewriting the Past. In early 1948, Europe seemed on the verge of a new cataclysm. To many in Washington, the constant communist-inspired strikes, toppling governments, and rumors of communist coups suggested that Moscow was either masterminding the early stages of a revolution or on the brink of launching an invasion. Alarmed by events in Europe, Congress approved a phenomenal $500 million budget for 1 year's scientific military research. And the Pentagon hastily set about rearming America for a new and some believed imminent war. Lofty principles and solemn promises, the Pentagon argued, must no longer be allowed to stand in the way of defending the nation. Innovation was at a premium, and any and every German with a modicum of scientific or technological knowledge was a potential target of a new dragnet, regardless of his past. For the military, especially the Air Force, it was an ideal moment to fuel hysteria in order to win blanket authorization for the indiscriminate issue of visas to Germans, despite the infamy or notoriety of their crimes. A note of frantic urgency crept into the impatient messages from Washington to Frankfurt, peremptorily demanding German scientists. 4 weeks after the sensational, quote, suicide, unquote, of Jan Masaryk in Prague in March and the communist coup in Czechoslovakia, Colonel Robert Taylor III, the chief of the Air Force Intelligence Requirements Division, wrote a long memorandum to support the Air Force's claim for more Germans. Taylor based his arguments on the patently false allegation that the Russians had grabbed the lion's share of German scientists. 17% of German scientists, he estimated, had gone to Moscow, while only 6% had gone to America, 11% to Britain, and a similar percentage to France. The estimate for Britain was wildly exaggerated, and the American figure much too low. Nevertheless, Taylor's assessment, which was supposedly based on intelligence channels, produced the desired effect. Quote, it is requested that every effort be made to obtain the services of Walter Schieber as soon as possible and to bring him to the U.S. It is believed that Dr. Schieber's talents are of so important a nature to the U.S. that they go far to override any consideration of his past political background, provided that he is not suspected of criminal acts. It is further considered to be of the utmost importance that he not be allowed to fall into the hands of a possibly unfriendly power, unquote. During the autumn of 1947, Schieber was among the 160 Germans being debriefed by the American Army, wanted him shipped to Ohio immediately. There was, however, a problem he needed urgently somehow to overcome. Although Schieber's technical qualifications were outstanding, the factories had been built by slave labor under the most atrocious concentration camp conditions. Schieber had not only witnessed and connived at the suffering of thousands, but had indisputably organized their predicament. As a passionate supporter of Hitler, a known confidant of the SS chief Ernst Kaltenbrunner, and a party member since 1931, he felt no qualms. Indeed, success had propelled him to the top ranks of the SS as a highly decorated general. In 1945, many would have willingly punished Schieber as a war criminal. Yet, in 1948, his future looked promising. Schieber's denazification trial was imminent. So, this is the Bosquet Webb, the guy that I told you about before. He's the director of the JIOA, and he is instructing everybody to go out and get these scientists, no matter what their records are. And that comes from the top. Both Put and Shao was one of the other JIOA men, were puzzled that Schieber had not benefited from the secret October 1947 agreement under which a visa could have been issued on a simple certificate from the War Department stating that his entry was, quote, in the national interest, unquote. The denazification tribunals were nominally under U.S. control, and they believed the results could have been manipulated. Webb shared their disappointment. Everyone concerned had blithely believed that it would be relatively easy to turn even ardent Nazis overnight into honest American citizens. Since there was to be no investigation and only the signature of Kenneth Royal, the Secretary of War, on the certificate was required. It was now clear that there was a need for some semblance of legality before senior officers and politicians would ignore a German's past. Webb had already noticed with interest that a visa application from Hermann Kurzweg, the former Peenemünde SS officer now supervising the coastal wind tunnel for the Navy in Maryland, had been approved by the simple expedient of rewriting his past. Rewriting his past. G2 officers in Germany had skillfully discovered, quote, understanding, quote, eyewitnesses who could provide extenuating circumstances to explain the unfortunate blot on Kurzweg's otherwise immaculate record. Here, Webb believed, was a method that even types like Schieber could exploit. The device seemed infallible. When issuing, quote, revised security reports, unquote, G2 simply needed to reverse any description that suggested the German was a Nazi. On December 12, 1948, Webb sent the director of intelligence in Frankfurt the names of 14 Germans whose Omgus security reports classified them as potential or actual threats to the U.S. Among the 14 were Herbert Axter, Werner von Braun, Theodor Benzinger, Adolf Thiel, that's Thiel, and I wonder if there's a relationship, there might be, with Peter Thiel, and Helmut Schlepp. All were long-serving Nazi Party members, and some had been in the SS or SA. Written at General Stephen Chamberlain's behest, Webb's letter giving the names of the 14 Germans was a masterpiece of deception. Ignoring the worst offenders, such as Axter, Webb claimed that some of those listed were wrongly condemned because they were merely party members. The security report on Werner Gengelbach, for instance, Webb wrote, described him as, quote, devoted to his family and profession and only a nominal party member and not politically active, always reliable and humane, unquote. Frankfurt was urged to reconsider its position on the potential threat of the German scientists to U.S. security on the grounds that, quote, the evaluation of the military governor with regard to reference specialist is unrealistic and based on a misunderstanding as to the purpose of the Omgus security report. Immigration of a specialist whose report is so worded is jeopardized, unquote. The remedy was the insertion of a, quote, saving clause, unquote, that would allow for reevaluation. The initial reaction in Germany to Webb's plea on Gengelbach's behalf was outrightly cynical. Quote, the extreme ease with which the most highly incriminated respondent can produce parades of favorable witnesses in his own behalf, wrote Robert Bruce, a military government officer, quote, and the correspondingly great difficulty encountered by public prosecutors in finding witnesses to present derogatory testimony, unquote, rendered the favorable testimonies about Germans worthless. Clearly irritated by JIOA's invitation to join an underhand conspiracy, Bruce pointed out that the American military government had refused to grant even temporary exit permits to a number of German girls engaged to American servicemen who were seeking medical treatment in Switzerland merely on the grounds that they had been Nazi Party members. Webb was asking for a lot more. Quote, it is felt that if state and justice departments do not see the necessity or value of immigrating subject specialists to the U.S., then this headquarters should not revise or change its opinion of subject scientists merely to circumvent the rules set forth by the state and justice departments, unquote. Webb filed Bruce's protest, and it was quickly forgotten. The task of smoothing the process of rewriting the Nazis' past fell to Lieutenant Colonel Walter Rosamus, JIOA's new deputy director. Rosamus, the son of Lithuanian immigrants, was a hardened and experienced intelligence officer who had courageously fought his way across Europe after landing on the Normandy beaches 2 days after D-Day. The supreme irony of Rosamus's appointment to JIOA was that in April 1945, he had been with the First Army's frontline platoons when they liberated Nordhausen. Quote, you're hardened by your feelings in war, but this time I just felt like breaking down and crying. It was just unbelievable and still haunts me at times, unquote. Vividly, Rosamus remembers with a shudder that the corpses stacked by the crematoria and others hanging from meat hooks were so emaciated that there was not even an odor of death. Rosamus had no doubts about who was to blame, Hitler and no one else, a simplistic but useful notion that nearly avoided any self-doubts about his duties to the Pentagon. 2 years later, Rosamus arrived at JIOA's office in order to help those responsible for the horrors at Nordhausen become American citizens. The irony completely escaped him, both then and 40 years later. Quote, what they did during the war was irrelevant, unquote, explains Rosamus. We didn't care about their background. We had to keep the scientists out of the Russians' hands because they were vital in any future war and they could do us some good, unquote. As a soldier, Rosamus simply accepted that, quote, they were fighting their war like we were fighting ours, and they were obeying orders just like us. What they had done didn't enter my mind. I was concerned about the security of my country. Similarly, he was blind to the paradox that while Pentagon staff accepted the Germans' excuse, U.S. Army prosecutors in Nuremberg were busy systematically demolishing the self-same argument. Paperclip was approved by the president, and it is my job to obey his orders, quote unquote, from Rosamus. And I'm skipping a few paragraphs here. For the military rapidly rearming against communism, the old criterion that Nazism was a threat to internal security was now an anachronism. Like Webb, most believed that, quote, beating a dead Nazi horse, unquote, served little purpose and was in fact self-defeating. Former Nazis were proving themselves willing and able allies against communism, which was, quote, jeopardizing the entire world, unquote. Here, there was, they felt, a sharp distinction between the political subversion, because Nazis believed in totalitarianism, and outright espionage. Both risks, the military believed, were negligible. With Webb's vigilant assistance, the Pentagon's press office was intent on projecting, quote, the correct image, unquote, of the typical German scientist. Some described their efforts as the best of Madison Avenue. To others, they smacked of the brainwashing and manipulation of Goebbels' propaganda. For his part, Webb was undoubtedly pleased with the result. Journalists were assured that no, quote, active Nazis, unquote, were being admitted to America, and as a novelty were offered a profile of a typical paperclip scientist. He had never been a member of the Nazi Party and had, quote, been arrested by Gestapo in June 1943 for subversive activities and sent to concentration camps of Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Gross-Rosen, Mauthausen, and Buchenwald. In fact, none of the paperclip scientists had ever been sent to concentration camps. The truth, of course, was that some of the scientists had cooperated with the Gestapo and others had exploited the helpless inmates of the concentration camps as slave labor or for unethical experiments. Obligingly, some newspapers submitted their stories to the Pentagon for correction. In an article about the elimination of big Nazis in the New York Times, Robert Burkhart followed the Pentagon's line that any scientists who were party members prior to 1933 or had been convicted by a denazification court were automatically eliminated from Paperclip. Unwittingly, he had relied on old Department of War press releases. Without a qualm, the Pentagon removed the, quote, mistakes, unquote. At the same time, other, quote, mistakes were being removed from the scientists' security reports. Herbert Axter's revised report now read, quote, subject was not a war criminal and was not an ardent Nazi. Von Braun's SS record was cleverly circumvented. His earlier security report said that, according to the military governor, he was, quote, regarded as a potential security threat, unquote. Webb requested that this earlier description be omitted from von Braun's revised report. Adroitly, the new report stated that, quote, investigation of the subject is not feasible due to the fact that his former place of residence in the Russian zone where U.S. investigations are not possible. No derogatory information is available on the subject except NSDAP records which indicate that he was a member of the party from 1 May 1937 and was also a major in the SS, which appears to have been an honorary commission. The extent of his party participation cannot be determined in this theater. Like the majority of members, he may have been a mere opportunist, unquote. The report concluded that since von Braun had been in the United States for 2 years, he was judged not to be a security risk, provided his behavior over the past 2 years had been satisfactory. Some mistakes could not be so easily removed. The investigation that reported that Dr. Wilhelm Eitel, who was researching synthetic materials for the Navy in Tennessee, had remained a passionate Nazi even after the war. In Germany, Eitel was regularly to be seen wearing a brown uniform and had collaborated with Dr. Wilhelm Frick, the Minister of Interior, over the dismissal of all his Jewish colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. Frick was later executed by the Allies for war crimes, and in 1948, Eitel was judged by G2 in Germany to be, quote, a security threat, unquote. But in America, where Eitel was in the midst of developing materials judged by the Navy to be of strategic importance, the real threat to security was the possibility of Eitel being returned to Europe. For the moment, however, even JIOA could not persuade G2 in Frankfurt to rewrite his past. The case of Kurt Debus, a close associate of von Braun, seemed equally intractable. In March 1947, General Lucius Clay's office had made a routine statement that, his record to the contrary, Debus was not an ardent Nazi. Just weeks later, his 1942 denunciation to the Gestapo of one of his colleagues as an anti-Nazi came to light. After investigation, Clay's office changed its classification to ardent Nazi and potential security risk. Despite the precedents established by the rehabilitation of Axter, Strughold, and Patton, JIOA could not obtain an immediate revision. Attempts were therefore made by American officers to provide an excuse for Debus's action. Their justification shows how just 2 years after the war, the military had wholeheartedly adapted for its own ends the Nazis' tortured excuses. Quote, Debus had not, his new security report stated, quote, deliberately denounced him, i.e. his colleague, but had been compelled to report their conversation to the Gestapo under his oath as an SS man, unquote. Most of the cases were comparatively straightforward, and by February 1948, 475 scientists awaited approval for visas. In December, the first six, all unincriminated, had been selected as a dry run to test the new agreement and establish a solid legal precedent. Progress was now expected to be swift, but once again, nothing happened. All three military secretaries remonstrated with General George Marshall, the Secretary of State. 2 years after the first approval of Paperclip, they complained, quote, not a single visa has been granted and no apparent progress in the matter has been made, unquote. Webb was convinced that the State Department's visa section was ignoring the secret agreement reached in October. Interesting to think about what was General Marshall's view on this paperclip process. In my mind, he's always seemed to be cooperative with the hand behind the curtain, but in this case, he seems not to be cooperating. So interesting to think about General George Marshall's perspective. Of course, the Marshall Plan is obviously a a tell that he was really in with the deep state. Once again, Webb, his fury barely constrained within the parameters of an official letter, wrote to the quote culprit, this time Hamilton Robinson in the visa section, demanding that he withdraw the unfulfillable list of documents and investigation that, despite the October agreement, Robinson insisted had to be supplied for each scientist. Progress, he complained, had been slowed to a snail's pace, and moreover, the ban on Nazis should be dropped in the national interest. It was a confused letter. Indeed, Webb was unable to conceal the fact that, although he was ostensibly protesting about the, quote, extremely tedious and laborious task which has been most time consuming, unquote, his letter was in effect a barely disguised demand that even convicted Nazis like Schieber should be granted visas. Quote, it was also cynical, for while Webb and JIOA were extolling the trustworthiness of the Germans, the intelligence division, fearing espionage, was ordering Fort Bliss to exercise tighter security and censorship controls over the mail, movements, and relationships of von Braun's team, unquote. Robinson realized that the pressure on the visa section was no longer confined to the secret outbursts of government officials. Critics in the Senate had begun to attack both himself and Sam Klaus for creating, quote, confusion, agitation, and turmoil, and were openly questioning where their loyalties lay. It was a foreshadowing of McCarthyism and would lead to the investigation of Klaus as a communist sympathizer. Robinson felt, however, that both legally and morally he was safe. The visa section had, as required, sent a new circular under Marshall's name to consuls that explicitly switched the criterion for granting admission from a past free of Nazi activities to an assurance that, in the future, a scientist was unlikely to, quote, engage in activities prejudicial to the public interest, unquote. The State Department's veto had been effectively neutralized. But in the process, Robinson found a new ally. All right. And I like this new ally. I'll take a short break and get right back to you. As ordered, the six quote, clean, unquote, files were forwarded to William Underhill at the FBI. But unfortunately for Webb, Underhill shared Robinson's prejudice that Nazi Party membership was a bar to American citizenship and a threat to internal security. Accordingly, Underhill insisted on meticulously checking FBI files on each scientist. Meticulously checking FBI files on each scientist. Does that sound like McDuff? Yeah, that's McDuff. This is, Underhill in 1948. But who gets those files in 1952? 52, 53, if I'm not mistaken. That's McDuff. Replying to Webb, Robinson gleefully placed the blame for the new delays on the Department of Justice and flippantly assured Webb that, quote, this department has taken a special interest in the cases of the German scientists in a spirit of helpfulness to the appropriate authorities and will continue to do so, unquote. Infuriated, Webb politely probed Underhill's motives to discover why his department's earlier support had suddenly altered, only to be brusquely rebuffed, quote, send the generals and admirals to me, unquote, Underhill retorted. Quote, I'm not afraid to tell them about it, unquote. Webb confided to Chamberlain, the chief of military intelligence, that he was genuinely baffled. Quote, it is difficult to understand why, in the face of the threat of communism to the security of the United States, such a concentration and delaying investigation must be instigated. Although 70 cases had been submitted to the Department of Justice, only one application, that of Heinz Schmidt, a Junkers jet propulsion expert at Wright Field, had been cleared. Neither Webb nor Chamberlain appreciated that the civilian officials were not only nervous of current criticism, but they also feared the adverse judgment of future generations. That would be us. 2 weeks later, on May 11, 1948, Chamberlain met J. Edgar Hoover, the autocratic director of the FBI. Hoover's solution was simple, quote, cut out all the red tape, unquote, he barked to one of his aides. Before the meeting, Webb had provided Chamberlain with a persuasive brief in order to convince the FBI director of the importance of supporting the operation. Each argument suggested that the Germans had rescued American science from the Dark Ages. $500 million had been saved on guided missile development alone. Now the military feared that if the Germans were not quickly granted visas, both their morale and their work would suffer. Hoover readily sympathized. Chamberlain moved on. There was, he said, another problem. Investigations had shown that a few of the Germans were more than nominal Nazis. No doubt they had done some unpleasant things, but this was war. Since their arrival, they had eagerly adopted the American way of life, and many of them were keen churchgoers. The choice, he said, the director of intelligence, was stark. Either we forget what happened during the war, or we allow the Germans to return to Europe. The second option had drawbacks. German scientists recently returning from Britain had been quickly contracted by the Russians, a generous and, from the U.S. point of view, damaging gift to Moscow. The same would happen if the Paperclip scientists were sent back. Hoover was impressed. Although he was not eager to admit ardent Nazis into America, his agents' prime targets were communists, not Nazis. The Paperclip scientists were in fact not the only Nazis whom Hoover would illegally allow into America. A large group of Belarusian fascists, that's White Russian or Belarus today, guilty of the murder of tens of thousands of Jews for the Nazis, had been recruited by the State Department in Europe as anti-communist agents, and after 1948 were admitted as immigrants with Hoover's connivance. At the end of the meeting, Hoover promised that Underhill's obstructions would be erased. The military now awaited approval of the revised security reports. The visas could be issued without further problems, and Webb's tenacity had been rewarded. 4 weeks later, on June 24th, 1948, his deep suspicions about Soviet intentions toward America were confirmed. All road and rail connections to Berlin were cut by the Russian soldiers. The Cold War had broken out. So far, 500 scientists and 644 dependents had arrived in America. Despite the scientists' contribution, the Army wanted to stop recruitment. Too much political effort was being expended, the reward seemed uncertain, and it was impossible to quantify the benefits accurately. A Pentagon proposal to, quote, emphasize to the American public that Project Paperclip is proving its worth floundered because the Pentagon could not produce precise figures for the actual value of the knowledge contributed by the Germans, although authorities place it in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Nevertheless, the Pentagon claimed that the program promises to save 2 to 10 years in American research, since the German experience has shown many blind alleys to be avoided and narrowed down the fields to be explored, unquote. Even if the Air Force and Navy believed that the benefits were considerable, the Pentagon disliked the high administrative costs and feared the harmful publicity that would inevitably ensue if the conspiracy was exposed. The Paperclip conspiracy, that is. Quote, we are on the ragged edge of cancellation, unquote, wrote Major General C.P. Cabell, that's Charles Cabell, the Director of Air Force Intelligence, to Harry Armstrong at the School of Aviation Medicine at Randolph Air Force Base, Texas, urging him to moderate his demands for more Germans. Armstrong had requested the recruitment of 14 more aviation doctors, in addition to another 39 already contracted by the Air Force under the escape clause. Armstrong did not oblige. He, like every other senior commander, was eager to recruit as many technicians as possible. If suitable Americans were not available, then the Germans had proven ideal substitutes. The arms race was no longer a novelty, it was vital for military supremacy. Digesting the development of wartime inventions by the Air Force and Navy was still incomplete, or had spawned a pace of obsolescence that was only gradually being understood. For the victors of 1945, the euphoria that followed victory had now all but disappeared, to be replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. Somehow, the other powers, even those without America's overwhelming wealth, seemed to be at least keeping pace with America's military development. Reliable intelligence reports confirmed that Russia's Air Force and Navy were being dramatically modernized. Senior German chemical and biological warfare experts were said to be working outside Moscow, and Russian rocket development was feared to be superior to America's. Indeed, the Air Force and Navy believed that this was the case for more Germans, not fewer. Pardon me. The new demands on America's armory were enormous. Submarine warfare, which until 1945 had been a British sphere of supremacy, was now being actively developed in the United States. Yet it was only 1948, 3 years after the Russians, that American naval designers began to master the advanced engineering and technology of German wartime design. German experts had developed the quietest submarines, and only German pathologists and physiologists had probed the problems of escape, emotional reaction under stress, and the behavior of gases underwater, especially oxygen toxicity. Accordingly, the Navy asked JIOA to secretly recruit a complete German submarine team on immigrants' visas. Other Germans were needed to operate the 3 new wind tunnels that had finally been assembled. Unknown to the Air Force, which prided itself on its 16-foot wind tunnel, the German team recruited by the French from Otzau were about to complete a 26-foot tunnel at Modane and had already started to construct 2 other supersonic wind tunnels. The U.S. Air Force's backlog of tests, it was claimed, would take 7.9 years to clear, and by then would have increased by 19.9 years. No American had either the necessary training or experience. Theodore Zobel, an aerodynamicist based at Wright Field, nominated 5 instrumentation experts in Germany. The Air Force asked for them to be recruited in the, quote, national interest, so as to, quote, deny them, unquote, to other powers. At Wright Field, Putt's staff was conscious that the new jet fighters flying at over 600 miles an hour at 50,000 feet needed new weapons and also new tactics in order to place the guns in a lethal firing position. Aviation armament in this country is seriously inadequate, asserted the Air Force. Creative aviation armaments designers of a caliber that did not exist in America were needed. The only remedy was to recruit Dr. Richard Brown and his 6-man team, which had developed a whole range of new weapons during the war at Rheinmetall Borsig and were known to have recently returned to Germany from Britain. By 1948, rewriting security reports, especially those that encompassed German denazification tribunal decisions, which were crudely distorted, had become a routine skill. Friedrich Wazelt, a committed member of the SS, described as a, quote, deceitful and sly, was granted his visa because, as JIOA reported, a denazification tribunal had classified him as a non-active party member on the basis of favorable testimonials. Reliance on tribunal findings had been condemned by senior military government officers in Germany because of the lucrative trade in fraudulent testimonies. Wittily nicknamed Persilschein, Persil being the name of a detergent and Schein meaning license, since the bogus certificates could wash off even the brownest stains. But Vazant was admitted on the grounds that his group's expertise in enhancing the stability of heavy bombers, quote, exceeds that of any group in this country, unquote. Accompanied by a military officer dressed in civilian clothes, the scientists and their families traveled in unmarked vehicles to the American consulates in Ciudad Juarez or Tijuana in Mexico or Niagara Falls in Canada. Each German arrived with a medical report certifying that he did not have tuberculosis or syphilis, 3 portrait photographs, and $18. His travel document was stamped with an immigrant's visa. After signing the necessary forms, each German walked back to the border and re-entered America legally, no longer under arrest. By September 1948, 7 scientists had been processed in Canada, and by March 1949, more than 100 had visas. Both Debus and Axter had to wait. A personal recommendation from Axter's visa was sent to Marshall, signed by Royal. Quote, although the reputation of his family in Germany was unfavorable, wrote Royal, surveillance in the U.S. for a period of more than 3 years has indicated that he has a wholehearted and sincere appreciation of American ideals. Fearful of political uproar, the War Department decided to wait. Although the intense pressure for visas had now abated, the importance of Project Paperclip was undiminished. On the contrary, reflecting the tension in Europe, recruitment for Paperclip was becoming more aggressive and more covert. By the time Webb left JIOA in July 1949, individual scientists in Germany were being systematically monitored and their importance assessed. Those of value had been secretly registered on an objectives list by the Anglo-American Combined Allocations Board. British intelligence, in particular, not only monitored their movements, but scrutinized all applications for foreign travel. A watch list was compiled of those employed in the Eastern Zone, noting the names of those who might be attracted by a Western offer. Seeking any route to deny their services to the Russians, the British offered the Germans attractive terms of employment in Commonwealth countries. Even Otto Ambros, Heinrich Butterfisch, Karl Krausch, and Georg von Schnitzler, the major IG Farben scientists convicted in as war criminals at Nuremberg and still imprisoned in Landsberg, were placed on the restricted movement list. Clearly, someone was contemplating employing them after their release. Other incriminated Nazis who had not been jailed were among the 150 leading scientists, quote, employed, unquote, on the, quote, consultants program, unquote, managed by Karl Nordstrom, the chief scientific advisor to the new High Commissioner to Germany, Clay's successor, John McCloy. The salary was nearly 2,000 marks per month for doing absolutely nothing, apart from staying in the Western Zone. Quote, they were not asked to do much, admitted Nordstrom, but made to feel that they are wanted, to tickle their egos, unquote. Financing unemployment was only one aspect of the strategy to control German expertise. By 1949, the Anglo-American blockade to prevent scientists from leaving Germany had collapsed, and a lucrative smuggling trade was flourishing, attracting those who were unemployed because of the manpower and economic restrictions. The majority of German scientists not offered contracts by the Allies, South America was an attractive alternative. The State Department's strategy to check the flow of German scientists seeking sanctuary in Argentina had been thwarted with impunity by well-organized syndicates. By well-organized syndicates. Who would that be? Applicants had a choice of routes. Interservice, an Argentine tourist agency in Frankfurt, directed approved Germans to the Zurich airport, where they embarked on Swiss, Swedish, or Dutch airlines. The alternative route was through Denmark. After the war, Lieutenant Colonel Günther Töpfke, formerly a senior aide to the German commander-in-chief of the occupying forces, had remained in Denmark as a liaison officer between the Allies and the surrendered Wehrmacht group, and also to supervise the removal of 2 million German landmines. For both tasks, Töpfke was entrusted with a pass for crossing the frontier. Exploiting the privilege, he escorted, by some estimates, more than 100 German armaments scientists to the Copenhagen airport before he was caught. By 1949, other routes were firmly established through Sweden and Italy. Robert Murphy, the political advisor in Germany, cabled the State Department saying he needed policy guidance since the, quote, deliberate large-scale official Argentine enticement of German military and civil technicians of every degree of ability and of Nazi affiliations had become virtually an open scandal, unquote. Every Argentine consulate in Europe had become a recruiting office. The State Department considered protesting, but was persuaded by the U.S. Embassy in Buenos Aires that a protest would be futile. Anticipating that the State Department would attempt to stop the immigration, JIOA quickly inaugurated a counter policy, the Point 4 program, which encouraged Germans to leave Europe for South America, using Switzerland as a staging post. In Argentina, Kurt Tank, the aircraft designer rejected by the British, had established an aircraft factory with the help of Hans Ulrich Rudel, the Luftwaffe ace who would become an important link between fugitive Nazi war criminals and their distant homeland. Other German scientists had founded Argentina's infant nuclear industry, biological warfare laboratories, and small arms factories. Murphy's colleagues at the State Department realized that to dissuade Argentina from the very policies the Allies were pursuing would require a feat of political gymnastics. On British advice, Washington reversed its policy and began encouraging immigration to South America and also to the Commonwealth countries as an effective means of denying scientific expertise to the communists. Even scientists exploited in Britain, whose competence was doubtful, had to be diverted from Germany to America in the interest of denial. Among those whose arrival from Britain was not announced were the chemical and biological warfare experts Erich Straub, Theodor Reitz, Max Gruber, and Friedrich Wilhelm Hoffmann. Their names had been deliberately excluded from, quote, any allocation list to date, unquote, and they would remain similarly anonymous in America. One of the announced arrivals was Helmuth Walter, the submarine and torpedo developer. By 1949, the Americans no longer regarded him as a great scientist, but rather as an enterprising promoter whose energy and business acumen had created a huge, albeit profligate, organization. Although the U.S. Navy had long since abandoned peroxide as a submarine fuel in favor of nuclear power, Walter was judged to be of denial importance, quote unquote, and was employed by Westinghouse. Among the more reluctant arrivals was Theodor Rakula, a turbine expert, who had been allowed to accept a Swiss contract by the British, but was at the last moment secretly, quote, persuaded by American agents to accept a paperclip contract with the U.S. Navy. It seemed as if the dustbin internment camp had been reopened in America. All right, I'm going to skip forward to a part where I think it's just very important because of our current concern about biological weapons and warfare, and read this part here on page 254. A former SA general, Kurt Blome, was a biological warfare expert and had joined the party in 1931. Hired by the U.S. Chemical Corps in August 1951, at a salary of $6,800 per annum, he was certified by McCloy as, quote, not likely to become a security threat in the U.S., unquote. Blome sold his general medical practice in Germany and contentedly awaited shipment. In contemplating his JIOA application form, the U.S. Army had deliberately omitted details of his career between 1945 and 1948. Nowhere in his JIOA file does it reveal that in July 1945, while being interrogated by an American scientist, he admitted that Himmler had ordered him in 1943 to use concentration camp inmates for experiments on plague vaccine. So this to me is very important because it confirms that we, as George Webb has been reporting, that it's the concentration camp inmates were used to experiment for vaccines during the war. Clearly eager to experiment, Blome suggested to Hitler that the SS finance a special isolation institute in Poznan for his work. Throughout the 1945 interrogation, he openly admitted that his intention to conduct human experiments was, and subsequent, he openly admitted his intention to conduct human experiments and was subsequently charged with crimes against humanity. Prosecuted at Nuremberg together with the aviation doctors, Blome was acquitted because the prosecution failed to prove that his intention to experiment with inmates had actually been realized. Shortly after his release from Nuremberg prison in 1951, Blome was interviewed about his work by Dr. H.W. Batchelor and 3 other American biological warfare experts from Camp Detrick, Maryland. By way of introduction, Batchelor explained to Blome through an interpreter that, quote, we have friends in Germany, scientific friends, and this is an opportunity to enjoy meeting him and to discuss our various problems, unquote. For the Americans, it was an ideal opportunity to discuss the whole area of German biological warfare, including Blome's own discoveries, and elicit his help in finding other German biological warfare experts. Batchelor was clearly delighted with his cooperation, and as a reward, he was offered a Project 63 contract. So, John McCloy takes over as head of JIOA, and boy, Who's he really work for? Well, I think you know the answer by now. Yep, I see Paulie's here in the comments saying, "Yep, McCloy's a Rockefeller guy." And who do you think is behind this idea of let's figure out some biological warfare vaccine technology? Okay, I think this was some important stuff today. I hope you also agree and share this with other people so that other people can indeed start getting up to speed because the SHTF is coming very soon.